Good day, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining today's edition of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York City, where I'm joined with my colleague, Michèle Flournoy. She served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy during the first Obama administration, where she was the principal advisor to Secretaries Gates and Panetta, formulating national security and defense policy, oversight of military plans and operations, and National Security Council deliberations. In 2007, along with the current National Security Council Coordinator for Indo-Pacific, Kurt Campbell, she founded the Center for a New American Security, a think tank dedicated to U.S. national security issues. And in 2017, along with current Secretary of State Tony Blinken, she founded the Teneo's strategic partner, WestExec Advisors, along with two other Obama-era officials. So, Michèle, thank you for joining me today and welcome.
Great to be back with you.
I guess I would like to start, considering that we're essentially on the eve of the counteroffensive that's expected out of Ukraine against Russia, to get your sense of kind of where things are right now. I think if we rewind the tape to, early February of 2022, the expectation was that Russia had the second best military in the world. It's not even clear if they have the second best military in Ukraine right now. Perhaps Wagner is performing better than the Russian regulars. But what is your sense of where the combatants are right now, what the condition of the Russian military is? Have they adapted to what has happened to them over the last year? And where does Ukraine stand after all of the battles that we've seen over the last year?
Well, it's clear that this has not gone according to Putin's plan. He thought he was going to roll in, dash to Kyiv, replace the government, install a puppet government, and be done with it. Well, didn't work like that for many reasons. The Ukrainians have really resisted, both as a people and as a military. Their military has been much more effective in countering a superior force. And the Russians have had a really hard time mounting joint operations, maneuver operations, sustaining logistics. They've been throwing people into the meat grinder of places like Bakhmut, and they're having challenges. They're not seizing a lot of territory. They're not making a lot of progress on the battlefield. And yet, I think Putin has failed to kind of really take stock of that. He still is pressing to sort of win this on the battlefield. And he's also ramping up the cost for the Ukrainian people by targeting civilian populations and critical infrastructure. So we're at a point where through the winter there has been some movement on front lines, but not a lot. I think this spring is really critical for the Ukrainians. They are planning a major counteroffensive. We know that. My expectation is that they will try to move south to break the land bridge, Russia's land bridge into Crimea, which is critical for them, while also putting more pressure in the east. But we'll see how they do. There's a lot that hinges on this. Everybody loves a winner. I think the more the Ukrainians are successful, the more likely that NATO will maintain this incredible cohesion we've had, providing both political support and arms to the Ukrainians. And I think the more it will hurt Russian morale on their side. So a lot is riding on this. At a minimum, we want to see them put themselves into a stronger position for whatever may come next, whether that's negotiations or what have you. But that said, I'm skeptical that this is going to end anytime soon. Wars end when one side wins on the battlefield. Neither side is close to that. One side gives up. I don't see that happening. Or both are exhausted. And I think we have a ways to go between they're exhausted enough to come to some kind of negotiating table.
So to that point, we've got a long road ahead of us. But it sounds like what you're saying, though, is that 2023 is a pretty important year for Ukraine. And I'm wondering, it's sort of implicit in your comments, is that we're about to hit a 2024 U.S. presidential election year. It is clear that the political spectrum in the United States isn't completely behind 100% Ukraine. There are those who don't necessarily see the national security interest the U.S. has in continuing to support Ukraine. There are even people on the political spectrum in the U.S. who are, quite frankly, pro-Putin. So are you concerned that as we go into that political silly season, if you will, that actual U.S. largesse could be at risk to a certain degree? And so therefore, what Ukraine is able to accomplish this year, to your point, that demonstration effect is going to be absolutely critical for them to achieve what they need to achieve on the battlefield so that they're in the best position when we get to that negotiation period.
Yeah. No, I do think there's more of a debate emerging, particularly among some in the Republican Party who have a more isolationist stance. But if you actually count noses, I think we're going to be able to sustain a bipartisan consensus through the end of Biden's first term. The real question is who is elected president. Is it someone, is it a Biden? Where, I think the support would remain very solid, or is it a Trump or a DeSantis who might have a more isolationist view and might be more willing to cut back or to press the Ukrainians to negotiate whether they feel ready for that or not. So I think it's more about who occupies the White House. I think that we can hold enough of a consensus to get us through the 24 election, unless we have some kind of disaster.
Right.
Or something that completely upends the apple cart on the ground in Ukraine.
So you know more about what it takes to fight a war than most people do. And, it occurs to me that wars can be won and lost for a lot of different variables, a lot of different reasons. But running out of ammunition before your opponent does is not really a strategy for victory. Yeah. So would you agree that Ukraine, when it is properly resourced with financially, military materiel and the like, has consistently prevailed on the battlefield? In other words, why aren't we giving them everything that they need to prevail on the battlefield? It seems like thus far we've been giving them what they need to keep themselves in the fight, certainly not to lose, but not to decisively win. And why aren't we doing that?
Yeah, I think there are two parts to the answer. One is there are some things that we have drawn down our stocks, or even our allies have drawn down their stocks, and there's just not a resilient, agile production pipeline that can ramp up quickly to resupply. So that ramping up is starting now, but it's not going to be as fast as we would like. And that's a lesson learned for the future. So that's why one of the things the administration's doing diplomatically is going to every possible partner and allied country who may have stockpiles of artillery shells or what have you, to see if we can't get them to provide that support to Ukraine. The second reason is that the Biden administration from the beginning has had, I think, the correct view that we do not want to turn this into a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. And I don't think Putin wants that either. And so they've worried about escalation. And so they've tried to avoid giving Ukraine things that would enable them to strike deep into Russia or, and potentially risk escalation. I think early on that was a very important concern. I think the Ukrainians have been incredibly respectful of that view and disciplined in their execution. And I think they have earned, in my personal view, a little more latitude from us to trust that we can give them some of the more powerful weaponry they're asking for, and they will not, abuse that privilege. They will not misuse it in a way that is escalatory. So I think we should be leaning in a little bit farther than we are. But I appreciate the objective that's driving the caution. I just think that at this point in time, we have a lot of evidence that the Ukrainians are trustworthy in this regard.
Yeah, it's notable to your earlier point. I mean, for all of the recklessness of the Russian military in Ukraine, they have been fastidious in not allowing a single bullet to land in NATO territory, essentially.
The other thing I'll say is Ukraine has de facto become a laboratory of how to make best, highest use of what you have and be both efficient and effective. I mean, part of transforming our military for the future is marrying legacy systems with software-driven solutions that ensure that you are expending each weapon with the best targeting, matching the best weapon with the best target, most efficient creation of effects. And they are a little laboratory for how to do that. And again, have been incredibly creative and agile and really quick studies in figuring that out.
Yeah, to that point, it's been notable every time there's been a new weapons platform that Ukrainian forces have been trained on by American military advisors. There's always been this kind of estimated time to train them up, and they're always coming in way under that. They're being very quick. Are you concerned? I know that there's been a lot of news stories about how badly the Russian military has fared in terms of casualties, 200,000 plus. Less is talked about specifically on the Ukrainian side, but we know it's pretty brutal there as well. As these newer and more powerful weapons come in, from the battle tanks to the Patriot air defense system to perhaps fighter jets down the road, what's the state in your view of Ukraine's military? Have they lost a lot of their kind of most elite troops in the fighting thus far, or is there enough talent still there to be able to wield these weapons effectively once they're in the theater?
There's absolutely enough talent there. I think the Russians are much more worried about this. They are, when you get to the point of asking contractors to bring out, release prisoners to send them to the front lines, you're in a pretty desperate situation. You've just seen Putin take a step to do the recruiting or the mobilization on a digital basis to try to prevent people from skirting that or leaving the country or hiding from that. He's counting on the Russian people to shoulder a lot of pain and suffering, which is something that he's done before. But he's just throwing people into the maw of the Ukrainian forces, and the casualty numbers are just staggering, and something that would almost be hard to imagine in a democracy. People standing for this. But on the other side, he's also ramped up repression, so that if you even say a word against the war or question the war, you're going to get jail time. So it's a terrible situation on the side of Russia. But I think the Ukrainians, yes, they've suffered casualties. Yes, they've suffered losses. But this is their homeland. This is their society. This is their freedom they're fighting for. And I think from what I've heard, the military is still absolutely cohesive and able to mount this counteroffensive and persist.
So as you say, the Russian way of fighting this war is a pretty cynical and extremely grim one. But the unfortunate truth is, with a population 3 times the size of Ukraine's, they can keep this up for a while. And so that brings me to my next question, which is, it seems to me that for all of the largesse that the United States and the West, but really led by the United States, has given, one thing that we have not done, or not done effectively to the American people, is articulate what our actual objectives are with regards to Ukraine. Because if we are, allowing them to fight to a stalemate, that favors Russia, it seems to me. They can carry this on for a very long time, hopefully to get a more amenable administration in the White House, or other events around the world conspire to take our eye off the ball or shift our priorities elsewhere. In other words, dragging things out advantages the Russians. A, do you agree with that? But B, do you think the U.S. has a real objective here? And if not, what do you think it ought to be, or what's the bare minimum of what it ought to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is work going on in the administration on the whole question of how does this end and what are our minimum essential objectives. But they've been very careful not to get ahead of the Ukrainians in a way that would undermine them. And, right now, Zelensky is pretty maximalist in his objectives. I want but understandably so, given the war crimes that Russia has committed, given the tremendous cost to the population, and given the injustice of the war. So, I think that we the key thing is that we can't allow this to end on terms that simply let Putin to live to, live to fight another day. I'm not suggesting that we roll in and do regime change in Russia, no. But I am suggesting that it can't be simply a pause that allows Putin to re-equip his forces and try again in 5 years. There has to be greater constraint than that. And this is going to be tough because right now there is no Venn diagram between what Ukraine would accept and what Russia would accept. But I think Putin has to be held accountable for what he's done here. And he's now an indicted war criminal. And that means that he's not going to be able to show up at, G8 meetings or G20 meetings and expect not to be arrested when he does so. So this is a really tough, it's going to be tough to thread the needle and find a set of objectives that will be acceptable to both sides.
So I want to come back to Putin in a minute, but I want to pick up on something that you just said. I mean, it seems to me that time and time again, several times in the 20th century, not just World War I and World War II, but throughout the Cold War, the Balkan War, and the like, it has been proven yet again that European security is essential to American security.
Absolutely.
And Ukrainian security is essential to European security. Thus, Ukrainian security is essential to American security. But you made the point that Zelensky continues to maintain some pretty maximalist aims, which I believe essentially means Russia out of all of the Ukrainian territory back to pre-2014 lines. Not to mention reparations and rebuilding of Ukraine and all of that, but in terms of the battlefield, back to the 2014 borders, if not earlier. Is there a point, though, then where U.S. and Ukrainian interests start to diverge? In other words, can we achieve the objectives that we need, meaning security for a viable Ukrainian state, providing security for Europe, thus to the United States, that doesn't require the maximalist aim that Zelensky still holds on to at this time?
I think it's an open and important question. I don't think we know the answer yet, partly because right now Zelensky has to take this hard line, given what Ukrainians have experienced, and given that they're still making progress and trying to put themselves in the best possible position to achieve their objectives. But at some point when, either things get frozen or stuck or exhaustion begins to set in, even on the Ukrainian side, they're going to have to wrestle with that question of what can we really accept? Well, this is what we aspired to, but what can we accept? Same is going to be true on the U.S. side. I'm sure there are quiet efforts inside the administration to think that through, but no one wants to force the question right now, because the imperative right now is to be 1,000% behind the Ukrainians as they try to really make progress in the remainder of this year. I think the other thing to consider here is not just the territorial situation, but what role will the West play in securing Ukraine in the future? I'm not necessarily talking about immediate NATO membership, although some argue for that, but security assistance, a major program of ensuring that we continue to rebuild, retrain, equip, help the Ukrainian military be able to deter a sort of future invasion or testing of the boundaries by Russia.
I mean, how do you feel about that question? I mean, in a sense, Russia is attempting the most radical violation of post-war norms we have seen in terms of a clear abrogation of internationally recognized territory.
Yeah.
And we have said, in this conversation that Ukrainian security is essential to European security, is essential to U.S. security. Ukrainians are fighting this war on all of our behalves, in a sense. Why not put them into NATO? They're fighting the war that NATO is essentially designed to fight.
Yep. I do think it is a much more serious question now after this invasion than it was before, because Russia, Putin clearly miscalculated that the West wouldn't care and wouldn't respond. But we take our own rhetoric seriously. I mean, we talked after the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, about Europe, whole, free, net peace. And that wasn't just NATO Europe, that was Europe.
Right.
And that includes Ukraine and other, states along the periphery. And I think that has been disturbed it has been violated in a way that has pulled Europe together, North and South, old and new. It's pulled the transatlantic alliance, the United States and Europe and Canada together. It's had exactly the opposite effect of what he'd hoped for, which was, they're all going to be divided, and I'm just going to waltz in there and recreate my sphere of influence. So I do think that, thinking through what is necessary to deter Putin from trying this again in the future, whether that's security assistance, whether it's greater economic integration, or whether it's actually some kind of security guarantee to Ukraine, I think those are going to be the questions that have to be resolved more broadly as we try to at the point at which we try to support the end of this conflict.
So as we look to the spring offensive and beyond, one of the things that a lot of military analysts seem to have cautioned about is the attempt to regain Crimea, that Russia is really dug in there and it would be very difficult to achieve militarily. But having said that, it seems to me, if we think about what our objectives are, one of those is a viable Ukraine. That as long as a Putin-controlled Russia has control of Crimea, they essentially have an economic on-off switch for Ukraine's ability to export its goods through the Black Sea. So can you foresee, because some of those same analysts suggest that, well, when we get to the negotiating period, some territory may actually be on the table. But can we achieve our objectives with Crimea not in Ukrainian hands?
I think Ukraine has to have a Black Sea port to be a viable economy. And I think that, if they are using this counteroffensive able to cut the land bridge that Russia has to Crimea and isolate it, then they're in a very good position to negotiate for that. But, whether we can see all of Crimea being handed back, that's a pretty aspirational goal. We'll have to see.
So, a year plus on, I mean, you spent your time at the Defense Department. You were in charge of policy. Here you've had this real world laboratory that you talked about. What has surprised? What have you learned about warfare from what we have seen play out over the last year that, say, surprised you or changed your thinking on certain things? And maybe a follow-up question to that is, what do you think China has learned from watching this war?
Yeah, I think that one lesson is it really pays to invest in our partners. After the seizure of or illegal annexation of Crimea, the United States, Canada, the UK, other NATO allies really doubled down on training and supporting the Ukrainians and helping them develop a new way of warfare, assuming they would be taking on, a much more conventionally superior enemy. So teaching them special operations techniques, sabotage, how do you have intelligence-driven operations, all of these things that made them much more agile. And frankly, the Ukrainian military of 2022 was a far cry from the Ukrainian military of 2014.
Absolutely.
And so Russia was really surprised. But it's a lesson about investing and helping our partners become porcupines. We now talk about the porcupine strategy vis-a-vis Taiwan, for example. Right. How do we help them create a more layered asymmetric defense that would buy them time for international support to arrive if China launched aggression against them? Logistics. The Russians fell apart on logistics initially. And I don't know if that was because of corruption. I don't know if they just undervalued the importance of it, but they literally were brought themselves to a standstill. And, the Ukrainians were pretty good at sabotaging a lot of that. But that's with very relatively short supply lines. So again, for China, you're going to come across 200 nautical miles of ocean and maintain your logistics, and you've never fought a war, and you've never really done this before. So are you really that sure you can pull this off? And what can we do to interdict, to complicate, to make that really hard for them if they try?
I want to move on to China in a moment here, but one sort of final question with regards to Russia. You referred earlier to the battle that's been playing out over the last 8 months for Bakhmut, which by all accounts is not particularly of strategic importance. No. And Russia, over 8 months and tens of thousands of lives, have not been able to achieve military success there. So let me just play devil's advocate. I mean, should we even really be worried about Russia? If they can't beat the Ukrainians for this tiny little town, how are they going to roll through Europe, so to speak? Or put another way, can you foresee, can Putin be a part of a solution, or is Europe only going to be secure in a potentially in a post-Putin Russia, post-Putin type Russia?
I mean, I don't think the threat is that the Russian military is going to roll through Europe. I think the problem is that Putin can use gray zone tactics, lobbying, munitions, using drones against civilian populations, critical infrastructure. He can be the spoiler that keeps the Ukrainian economy on its knees indefinitely.
Right.
And that's what we have to put a stop to by stopping him on the battlefield, so that we're able to negotiate additional constraints. Now, I think that as long as Putin is in power, he's going to be trying to find a way to recreate, great Russia, a sphere of influence on his periphery. I don't think he's ever going to be welcomed back to the international table. He's made himself a war criminal and a pariah.
Yeah.
I don't think it's up to us to change his regime, but I think his leadership will be sorely limited, at least internationally, in the wake of this. And then it's up for the Russian people, up to the Russian people to decide whether they need a more effective leader.
So much has been made of the relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping, and clearly, Russia is the junior partner in this relationship, but they continue to rhetorically double down on it. Can China afford to let Russia lose this war?
I think that China can afford to let Russia, put lipstick on the pig and accept some negotiated outcome at some point. What China really needs from Russia is A, its energy supplies, and B, its diplomatic assistance when pushing back against the United States or the West in various international fora. This is a marriage of convenience, pretty fraught history between these two countries. It is not, in fact, a partnership without limits, but it's a marriage of convenience. And so Russia, I'm sure China would like to keep that. But, I also think that, Xi's been careful to separate himself from Russia's actions in Ukraine, and, is trying, and he's not condemning it, but he's also not, celebrating some of Putin's worst and most egregious actions either.
One of the most fascinating things to sort of watch is China tie itself in knots trying to explain its foreign policy to the world, in a sense, right? So on the one hand, they, and one of my favorite terms is their sort of pro-Russian neutrality, or what have you, what they refer to the war with. But they put forward this vision, they put forward a peace plan, they say they are neutral. Yeah. They have, throughout the Communist Party era, have talked about one of their what's most, the sanctity of sovereignty, the sanctity of borders. They use that in their own arguments with regards to Taiwan, as well as any kind of commentary on their domestic, on the domestic politics. But all of which would suggest that the Ukrainian war would go against everything that they argue for. On the other hand, the bigger picture for them in many ways is making the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party, and that means rolling back unquestioned U.S. hegemony. Right. What do you think about China's sort of foreign policy position right now?
It's complicated, and hypocritical in many cases, but they really they seem to keep tailoring their foreign policy expression to a given audience that they're engaging with, forgetting that the rest of the world is hearing how this changes from place to place. So you're right. They have been hypocritical on Ukraine. They talk about the UN Charter, they talk about sovereignty, they talk about non-intervention, and yet they've said nothing to condemn Russia's actions on Ukraine. They're on a charm offensive. They're trying to sort of say, hey, we're the peacemakers. You know, the U.S., they went to war in Afghanistan. They went to war in Iraq. They're supplying arms and stoking the war in Ukraine. We are going to show up with our 12 principles, which, if you read them carefully, there's not a lot of there. We're going to show up and try to mediate detente between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We're going to be, the peacemakers. We're offering to mediate end to the conflict. But at the same time, you look at Chinese behavior. They've been very aggressive in the East China Sea against Japan, in the South China Sea against Vietnam, Philippines, in the Taiwan Straits against Taiwan. Now we've seen that multiple times. The international, international body that rules on issues of law of the sea, they basically sided with Philippines, and China ignores that. So, they're on a charm offensive for the global South, and yet it is really hard to square with their own behavior in their own backyard and in other realms. So, I don't think it's terribly effective.
So you've got this complicated relationship with the Ukraine-Russia war. They've just completed their leadership transition period, the contestation for the East and South China Seas, and an ongoing trade war with the United States started back in 2018. But I wonder, they have been on a charm offensive, as you said, but not just with the global South. Chancellor Scholz was recently in China, and most recently President Macron and President von der Leyen. In both cases, the Germans and the French brought major business contingents with them. President Lula from Brazil was also just in China.
Yeah.
There's a lot of outreach here that is going on, some of which has some positive externalities, right? I mean, China is buying Russian oil, which we want Russian oil to continue to flow. We just don't want Russia to benefit economically from this. Chinese business is working to keep, with their EVs and renewable technologies and so on, that is going to conspire to bring down global emissions over time. So, it's being effective. And I just wonder, it sounds like there's some movement again after Secretary Blinken's trip to China was derailed by the balloon incident, that the groundwork is being laid perhaps for Secretary Yellen, Secretary Raimondo, ultimately Secretary Blinken, again to go and engage with the Chinese at a bilateral level before perhaps in November at the APEC meeting in San Francisco that Biden and Xi may meet. Should we be engaging more regularly with China? It seems like when things are difficult, that's when you should be talking to your opponent. There's a reason why diplomats exist.
Absolutely. And I don't think the U.S. has any problem with our friends and allies engaging in a positive way with China. We would like to engage more with China, and every time we try, we get the hand. The idea is not a new Cold War. The idea is not to contain China or decouple from China. It's neither wise nor possible. What I think the U.S. is trying to do is, let's focus on a level playing field for trade. Let's disentangle ourselves and reduce our vulnerability when it comes to supply chains or dependencies in China that touch on our national security or our technological competitiveness in the future, especially in technologies that impact on defense and national security. And I actually think European governments understand that. I mean, yes, there are business delegations going in, and maybe there's French luxury good companies or, German automakers, okay, fine. But what the administration has been focused on with its export controls and now with this draft executive order on outbound investment is let's be sure that we are not accelerating China's progress in technology areas that will come back to bite us in terms of our national security or our own competitiveness, technological competitiveness. And that's where we're having, I think, a very productive conversation with allies. And at the government level, there's a lot of alignment and a multilateralization, if you will, of some of these efforts. Not perfect. There are always going to be some differences of opinions, but the cooperation is pretty strong.
Do you think that some of the potential policy, or at the very least the rhetoric out there, has shifted, though, from trying to, help our economy and our economic actors remain ahead of China, particularly in the very sensitive areas and areas of 21st century importance? Or has it kind of evolved into, not only do we want to stay ahead, we actually want to stop and retard their progress as well? And that is what is, concerning particularly to the Chinese and something that they are going to react to.
I don't think that's a general approach, but I think that is the approach in the realm of semiconductors, because allowing the Chinese to get to advanced chips will enable them to dramatically improve the quality of their military, dramatically improve their capacity to use AI for national security purposes, dramatically improve their ability to export surveillance technologies to other authoritarian regimes. So I think the U.S. has decided we actually do have a national security interest in trying to retard their progress and keep them from accelerating down this path of digital modernization. But I don't think that's a general policy. I think there are going to be very few technology areas where that is the case, because it really matters to national security.
So to be clear, you feel like the European powers in the United States are essentially in agreement with regards to China. I mean, obviously the media wanted to make a very big deal about Macron's trip.
I think Macron is an outlier, honestly.
But he is a powerful economic and military force within, right? I mean,
so I don't want to suggest there's perfect consensus. I think there's a lot of consensus. There's been an opening of the eyes, a much more clear-eyed perspective within the EU of, the kind of actor that President Xi specifically is in China, and that we're dealing with a much more assertive, aggressive, emboldened China than we were facing under other previous leaders 10, 12, 15 years ago. So I think there is an awareness of that. We're still trying to figure out what our strategies are and still trying to figure out how much are we in agreement on the how of, how to approach this, how to manage it, how to deal with it. I think it's very important to say that everybody's objective is to manage this competition and keep it short of actual conflict.
Right.
Nobody wants to see an open conflict between two nuclear-armed powers, but the debate is about how best to do that, and it's further complicated by the politics of this. So in the United States, especially as you go into a presidential election season, it's all about who's tougher on China, and the more we pull that debate, to the right, the more it shrinks, the Biden administration's political space for cooperation, even on things that we can all agree are in our interests, like combating climate change or limiting proliferation of nuclear weapons in the region or what have you.
So just to digress for 1 second, get wonky for a second here. A couple of years ago, there was a very big deal when Australia got themselves out of a deal with France for submarines, right? And that gave rise to the AUKUS deal between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States to provide nuclear submarines to Australia. France got very upset that they lost out on this deal. And obviously, there's more to it than just submarines, but that's where the media attention has been. Do you think if you're Australia, after the Macron visit to China, you feel pretty vindicated in making that decision?
Yeah. I think the Australian perspective on China is much more aligned to the American one than to the views that Macron expressed when he was in Beijing, for sure.
So do you get concerned just as you watch these reactions? And France has been an outlier since right after World War II ended, and they left the NATO military command and so on and so forth. They've always been a little bit of an outlier versus, say, our relationship with the United Kingdom as an example. But clearly, China is on a charm offensive throughout the global South. They are on a charm offensive with corporate leaders around the world. And the United States has, let's be honest, it's become somewhat more isolationist on average. It has become there's a more vocal nationalistic fervor in the country, and when you add up a lot of things, from the Iraq War to the pullout of Afghanistan, the global financial crisis, that American sort of moral authority has deteriorated a little bit, compounded by putting all of these things on endless loop on RT and Chinese media and so on that's being shown in the global South. Do you think, as sort of Larry Summers, said in a Bloomberg interview the other day, do you think U.S. influence is kind of waning, and we need to get that moral authority back?
I don't know that I'd put it in terms of moral authority. I think, with the election of Donald Trump, we had a president that for the first time in decades was outside the bipartisan consensus on the boundaries of foreign policy. And so, if you used to see, I guess it started actually earlier in the Bush administration, particularly with the Iraq War, was a very polarizing decision. And it really divided Americans on people for and people against. But Trump took that to the extreme. I mean, he really rejected the fundamental premises of that the U.S. it's in the interest of the United States to be a global leader, to work to have global interests, to have this global network of alliances as a source of tremendous strategic advantage, to be leaning in and proactively engaging to shape the international environment. Trump really rejected that. He had this very narrow view about, what's the trade balance. And, if Korea's, got an unfair trade balance, I'm going to pull all the troops out of Korea. I mean, just this very bizarre and simplistic approach in my view. But so I think it was more that experience that our allies, have been left wondering, like, I don't know what I'm going to get in 2024. I don't know what I'm going to get from America in the future. And you're right, there is a more isolationist, a larger voice in the Republican Party in particular than there has been in the recent past. So they're hedging their bets. And, you take what's happened in the Gulf. When Saudi critical energy infrastructure was attacked by Iran, and the United States did not respond in any way meaningfully, other than rhetoric.
Right.
That was a shocker of a moment for the Saudis. And it contributed to the sense that we've got to hedge our bets and, start cooling off tensions with Iran, explore a relationship with Russia, explore a relationship with China, and have a more multilateral approach as opposed to relying so much on the United States. Now, I'm not blaming it entirely on the United States. Saudi behavior, the Khashoggi murder, all of that, their violation of human rights, all of that has contributed to the problem. But we do see this hedging behavior. And I do think it's important that the United States push back against that. And, I actually think the Biden administration, with a few exceptions, has done a pretty good job of rebuilding, particularly with our NATO allies and with key allies in Asia Pacific, that greater sense of partnership.
So you're talking about geopolitics and foreign policy and diplomacy and the like. Let's take you back into the Pentagon here for a couple of minutes, because clearly one of the most important tools in the president's toolbox is the threat of the hammer in a sense. How well prepared are we, do you think? I mean, considering that we're seeing playing out in Ukraine 100 years worth of warfighting strategy, from trench warfare all the way up to cyber. And, critical minerals are coming from a more diverse part of the world versus where oil was concentrated, as an example. And then you look at the Indo-Pacific, right? 60% of the world's population, 2/3 of the world's landmass, 65% of global GDP, and military expenditure led by China that is just going on a straight line, up. But China's military expenditure is second only to the United States, and that was focused in that area where we have to have this kind of global footprint and so on. Are we, and knowing that it takes decade plus to really move weapons platforms design, procurement, and delivery, are we positioning ourselves right for this for the 21st century challenges in your view?
I think the administration, the Pentagon leadership, both military and civilian, is seized with this problem. But it's hard to turn the aircraft carrier. It's hard to change acquisition practices. It's hard to introduce agility and speed, greater speed to scale, bringing new technologies, new capabilities into the force in a way that, with the urgency that's needed. We know that Xi has put down a marker for his military, that he wants them to give him options for the use of force against Taiwan by 2027. So we now have a time frame to work against, that we've got to be confident in our ability to deter him, make him feel it's too risky, too hard. He doesn't have the confidence that his military could pull it off, etc. But the name of the game in that kind of time frame is not transforming the whole military. It really is focusing on what are the critical operational problems we have to solve. How do we do that with our legacy force by bringing in new technologies that enable that force to achieve new outcomes? And a lot of that will be integrating new software, defined approaches, whether it's AI-enabled tools, decision support, intelligence enablers, et cetera, to just give us that edge. So that is what I think we should be focused on. Transforming the whole military is going to be a decades-long process.
But essentially, the NATO doctrine that's changing from deterrence by retaliation to deterrence by denial, this is something we need to sort of
absolutely need to apply that to Taiwan and other cases in the Indo-Pacific.
So I want to ask you a few more questions just in our last few minutes that we've got left. The first is, for all the talk about the big weapons platforms, the issue that keeps coming up time and again in Ukraine is the artillery shells, the expansion, that how fast they've been fired off by both sides, quite frankly. But also on things like javelins and stingers and the like, and that the production lines can't keep up with the pace that they have been fired off, not to mention the fact that we've got to have arsenals ready for any other contingencies that are out there. How do we properly incentivize the arms manufacturers to keep these sort of lines of production up and running if the sort of the demand kind of goes like this over time?
Yeah. This is an area where we need to take a longer view. Historically, whenever the services feel under budget constraint, and even with record high budgets, there's always more program than budget, right? They always feel like they're making trade-offs. And typically they cut munitions buys in order to keep bigger platform, aircraft, ships, et cetera, keep those programs healthy. I think we now need to take a different strategic approach, which is say we're going to have multi-year procurement to create stockpiles of these different munitions that either we or our allies will almost certainly use in the future. When you talk to the commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, what's high, if not the top thing on his list of unmet needs? Inadequate munitions to sustain any kind of effort. in the theater. So we've got to take a different approach. I applaud the Pentagon has actually asked the Congress for the first time in a long time for multi-year procurement. That gives the manufacturers the predictability to go ahead and build the additional production capacity so that they can sustain it over time. And that it kind of limits the peaks and valleys and puts them on a more steady, predictable footing.
I wanted to ask you about another platform that nobody really likes to talk about, although Putin has put it back on the, in the conversation, his threat to use nuclear weapons. But there's something else that's been going on that's been talked a lot about in the foreign policy community and in the strategic community. But it burst onto the front page of the New York Times last week, David Sanger article about China's fast-moving building up of its nuclear arsenal. And I'm wondering what that is doing in terms of strategic planning inside the Pentagon, because it seems to me that game theory about deterrence works if you've got two adversaries with roughly equal arsenals. But if you add a third into that makes it infinitely more complex.
The answer is that in places like STRATCOM, which has responsibility for our nuclear arsenal and strategy, new thinking is happening, because China was always seen as a lesser included case, meaning if you could deter Russia, you could deter China because it had such a much smaller arsenal. I think when you have a larger arsenal on the Chinese side and the potential for the two to collaborate, you really do have to rethink what is necessary for deterrence and how do we deal with that. And I think they're literally in the process of trying to rethink that, war game it, try to understand what that means for our arsenal, etc. One of the most disturbing things is just the gradual collapse of the arms control regime. Russia's just walked away from New START. That's going to give us less confidence. We can still have a pretty good sense of what their arsenal it looks like, and from national technical means. But having had the ability to do on-site verification and engagement, we had a much more refined sense of exactly where they were. We don't have that with China at all, and so it's a big challenge, and you're right to raise it, because honestly, nuclear weapons have been, thankfully, kind of on the back burner for a long time, and now we're going to have to deal with them as part of our strategy much more seriously.
So we're going to have...
I mean, in the sense of how do we deter? Right,
exactly. Yeah. So we're going to have you back, because we haven't even had a chance to touch on some of the other areas like North Korea, some of the evolution of what's going on in the Middle East right now, et cetera. But I do want to ask you one last question, because it's a timely one right now. In recent weeks, the defense and intelligence community has been rocked by the disclosure of some strategic plans and intelligence. And as it turned out, it was leaked by a 21-year-old reservist up in Massachusetts. So I guess my two questions for you are: one, it seems after the initial shock and awe that the concern over the intelligence itself has kind of gone down a little bit. But I'm wondering how damaging you thought it was. But secondly, this unanswered question of why did this type of a person have access to that intelligence, and is there a good reason why people like that have access to intelligence?
So these documents were basically part of the Chairman's Daily Brief, which covers the world and includes some of our most sensitive...
Chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Yes, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Includes some of the most sensitive intelligence in terms of sources and methods. And it's pretty wide-ranging. It covers just about everything that the chairman would be interested on a given day. Our system has been built on clearing people for access at different levels, but it's also supposed to always then be further filtered. Access, beyond access, is need to know. And this person had access because he was, I guess, had a role in maintaining the IT system on which these documents are placed, the classified IT system. But he certainly didn't have a need to know. And so I think what you'll see the Pentagon do now is a very rigorous scrub that tries to restrict the number of people that have access to the most sensitive intelligence and ensure that the processes are refined to add this further filter of need to know, which has always been intended, but clearly wasn't practiced in this case. And so I think you're going to see a real tightening up of the system. I don't think it's going to affect people who are like part of a mission on a battlefield.
Right.
But some, junior IT specialist in a National Guard unit, really doesn't need to be seeing the chairman's daily brief every day. And so that I think that's going to get tightened up pretty quickly.
Well, from wars being fought to who has access to intelligence, all of this is a work in progress. So I know we'll have to continue this conversation going forward. But Michèle, I want to thank you for joining me today. Michèle Flournoy, everyone. She is the head of WestExec Advisors, strategic partner of Teneo. We'll be having her back on as things progress. And until next time, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a great day.